perfect today. The family made their way to their suite, a spacious two-bedroom setup with rustic wooden furniture and cozy plaid blankets. True to the staff member's word, the view was spectacular. The slope stretched out before them, dotted with skiers and snowboarders carving through the snow. "This is going to be amazing," Mike said, dropping his bag onto the bed. "Fresh air, no emails, and nothing but snow for miles." "And Wi-Fi," Sophie added, already scrolling on her phone. "And adventure," Jake chimed in. "I'm hitting the slopes first thing tomorrow." Emily laughed. "We'll all hit the slopes, but let's start with dinner first. I heard the lodge restaurant serves a mean roast chicken." Hitting the slopes. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the snow-covered mountains as the Harris family stepped out of the lodge, bundled up in their ski gear. Their breaths formed little clouds in the crisp air, and the sound of skis scraping against the snow filled the air around them. Sophie snapped another picture for her social media while Jake fidgeted impatiently, eager to get going. "All right, team," Mike said, clapping his gloved hands together. "Let's start with the beginner trail. We'll get a feel for things before we take on the bigger slopes." Jake groaned. "Come on, Dad, I've been watching snowboarding videos for weeks. I'm ready for something cooler." Emily adjusted her goggles and smiled. "Let's make sure you can stay upright first, then we'll talk about cool." The family shuffled over to the ski lift where a friendly attendant helped them load onto the chair. As they ascended the slope, the view expanded, revealing a panoramic vista of snow-capped peaks and deep valleys. Sophie leaned back, snapping pictures of the scenery. "It's so quiet up here," she said, almost in awe. "Like peaceful quiet." "Enjoy it," Emily said. "It's part of the magic." At the top of the slope, they shuffled off the lift and gathered at the starting point. The beginner trail wound gently down the mountain, perfect for getting the hang of things. Emily went first, gliding down with practiced ease. Jake followed, wobbling slightly but keeping his balance. "Not bad, Jake," Emily called over her shoulder. "Told you I've got this," Jake shouted back, gaining confidence. Mike went next, his movements a little stiffer but steady. Sophie hesitated, adjusting her skis nervously. "Are you sure I won't fall?" "Everyone falls," Mike said encouragingly. "That's how you learn." Taking a deep breath, Sophie pushed off. She wobbled, arms flailing, but managed to stay upright. A triumphant grin spread across her face as she picked up speed. "I'm doing it." The family spent the morning mastering the beginner trail. By lunchtime, they were ready for a break. They stopped at a chalet halfway up the mountain where the smell of hot chocolate and freshly baked pastries greeted them. "This is amazing," Sophie said, cradling her steaming mug. "I think I'm actually starting to enjoy this." "Told you it'd be fun," Jake said, grinning. Mike leaned back in his chair, his face relaxed. "All right, how about we try the intermediate trail this afternoon? It's a little longer, but not too steep." Jake nodded enthusiastically. Sophie hesitated, but eventually agreed. "As long as I don't have to do any crazy jumps." "No jumps," Emily promised. "Just smooth skiing." The cabin in the woods. The intermediate trail was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. The path wound through a quieter section of the mountain where tall pines lined the trail, their branches heavy with snow. The air was still, the only sound the swish of skis and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Halfway down, Jake suddenly skidded to a stop. "Hey, look over there," he said, pointing into the trees. The rest of the family stopped behind him, following his gaze. Through the dense forest, a small wooden cabin stood partially hidden. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and its windows were dark. The structure looked ancient, as though it had been abandoned for decades. "What is that?" Sophie asked, her voice tinged with unease. Mike frowned. "Probably an old ranger station. This area has a lot of history." "It looks creepy," Sophie muttered. Jake's eyes lit up. "We should check it out." Emily grabbed his arm before he could move. "Absolutely not. It's off the trail, and we have no idea if it's safe." "Come on," Jake protested. "What if there's something cool in there, like old maps or treasure?" Or broken floorboards and wild animals, Emily interjected firmly. We're sticking to the trail. Let's keep moving. Jake huffed but didn't argue further. As they resumed their descent, Sophie couldn't help glancing back at the cabin. Something about it felt off, as though it were silently watching them leave, the missing board. The Harris family returned to the lodge that evening, their faces flushed with cold and exhilaration. The day had been filled with excitement and progress on the slopes, and even Sophie admitted that skiing was starting to grow on her. After a hearty dinner in the lodge's restaurant, complete with steaming bowls of soup and freshly baked bread, they retreated to their suite to relax. Jake stepped onto the balcony to check on his snowboard, which he'd left propped neatly against the railing. The cold air nipped at his face as he scanned the deck, but his board wasn't there. Mom? Dad?" he called into the suite. "My board's gone." Emily joined him, wrapping her sweater tightly around herself. "What do you mean, gone?" Jake gestured to the empty spot. "I left it right there. Now it's just not." Mike appeared behind them, frowning. "You sure you didn't bring it inside?" Jake shook his head firmly. "I know where I left it." Sophie smirked from the doorway. "Maybe a squirrel ran off with it." Jake glared. "Very funny." Emily sighed. "Maybe one of the staff moved it. We'll check with them in the morning." Despite her reassurances, an uneasy feeling lingered in the air. The idea that Jake's snowboard had simply disappeared seemed implausible, and even Sophie found herself peering out into the dark woods as if expecting to see something or someone out there. The next morning, after a restless night, Jake was the first to bring up the missing board during breakfast. "Do you think someone could have stolen it?" he asked, pushing his scrambled eggs around his plate. Emily looked up sharply. "I doubt it. This is a family resort, not a big city." "But things don't just vanish," Jake insisted. "I didn't imagine leaving it out there." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "We'll ask the staff. Maybe someone picked it up thinking it was abandoned." Jake didn't look convinced, but he dropped the subject. The family bundled up and headed to the main desk to report the incident. A young woman in a red lodge sweater greeted them with a cheerful smile. Her name tag read Hannah. "Good morning. What can I help you with?" Jake stepped forward, his voice edged with frustration. "My snowboard disappeared last night. I left it on the balcony and now it's gone." Hannah's smile faltered. "That's strange. We don't usually have issues like that. Did you check with the rental shop? Sometimes boards get turned in there by mistake." "I know where I left it," Jake replied firmly. "It wasn't at the rental shop." Hannah frowned. "Let me check with housekeeping. They might have moved it while cleaning the exterior walkways. Give me just a moment." She stepped into the back room, leaving the family waiting in silence. Sophie glanced out the large window near the desk. Snow was falling softly, covering the slopes in a fresh layer of white. Everything looked serene and perfect, but the tension in the room was palpable. Hannah returned a few minutes later, shaking her head. "I'm sorry. No one has seen a snowboard matching your description. I'll make a note of it and let our staff know to keep an eye out." "Thanks," Emily said, though her tone was laced with worry. "We'll keep checking around." As they stepped back into the crisp mountain air, Jake's frustration boiled over. "I told you someone took it. I bet it's those kids we saw yesterday at the slopes. They look sketchy." "Jake, we're not accusing anyone," Emily said firmly. "Let's not jump to conclusions." Sophie rolled her eyes. "It's just a snowboard, Jake. Chill." "It's not just a snowboard," Jake snapped. "It's mine, and if someone's messing with us, I want to know." The day unfolded as planned, with the family returning to the slopes. Jake, now armed with a rented snowboard, was quieter than usual. His eyes scanned the crowd, watching other skiers and snowboarders as if expecting to see someone riding away on his missing gear. By midday, the tension began to ease. Sophie had mastered a small jump on the intermediate trail, earning cheers from Emily and Mike. Even Jake seemed to forget his frustration as he attempted some tricks of his own. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow, a familiar unease crept back over Jake. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every crackle of branches or crunch of snow seemed amplified, and his gaze kept drifting toward the edge of the woods. "I'm heading back to the lodge," Jake announced after their last run. Emily glanced at her watch. "We'll come with you. It's almost dinner time." As they made their way back, Jake trailed behind, his thoughts swirling. Just before they reached the lodge, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer in the snow just beyond the trail. He hesitated, squinting into the fading light. "Jake, come on!" Sophie called, but he ignored her. Stepping off the trail, Jake approached the gleaming object. His breath caught in his throat. There, half buried in the snow, was his missing snowboard. Into the woods! Jake stood frozen, staring at his snowboard lying partially buried in the snow. The bold sticker he'd placed on it, an intricate design of a mountain surrounded by stars, gleamed faintly under the fading sunlight. He reached down, brushing away the powder, his mind racing. "What's taking you so long?" Sophie called, her voice distant. She and the rest of the family were already several meters ahead, just steps from the lodge. "It's my board," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found it." Sophie stopped, her brow furrowed. "What? Where?" Jake pointed, lifting the board for her to see. She hesitated, then hurried over, her skis crunching through the snow. "That's so weird," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Why would it be all the way out here? You left it on the balcony." Jake shrugged, his grip tightening on the board. "I don't know. Someone must have taken it and left it here. Who would do that, and why?" Sophie looked over her shoulder, scanning the quiet woods. The sun was almost gone now, casting long shadows across the snow. "This doesn't feel right. Let's just go back." Jake hesitated, glancing toward the woods. Beyond the trail, the forest loomed, dark and foreboding. What if whoever took it is still around? Sophie rolled her eyes, though her unease was evident. "Jake, this isn't some horror movie. Come on, let's—" She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on the edge of the trees. "Did you see that?" Jake followed her stare. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow between the trees. His heart raced and he instinctively stepped closer to Sophie. "There's someone out there," Sophie whispered, gripping his arm. "Let's find out who," Jake said, his curiosity overriding his fear. Sophie shook her head furiously. "Are you insane? No way, we're going back to the lodge right now." But Jake was already stepping off the trail, his snowboard tucked under his arm. "I just want to see. Maybe it's someone who works here." "Jake," Sophie hissed, glancing back toward the lodge. Their parents hadn't noticed they'd fallen behind. "Mom and Dad are going to freak if they find out." "Then don't tell them," Jake said over his shoulder, his tone firm. "Stay here if you're scared." Sophie groaned but followed, muttering, "You're impossible." The snow was deeper off the trail, crunching loudly under their boots as they ventured into the woods. The air was colder here, and the towering pines blocked most of the fading sunlight. Jake moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the ground for footprints or other clues. "This is so stupid," Sophie muttered. "If we get lost, it's your fault." "We're not going far," Jake replied, though he wasn't entirely sure of that himself. His pulse quickened with every step. Something about this felt wrong, yet he couldn't stop. After several minutes of walking, they came to a small clearing. In the center stood a familiar silhouette, the cabin they had seen earlier from the trail. Its dark windows and sagging roof looked even more eerie up close. Snow piled high against its walls, and the door hung slightly ajar. Sophie grabbed Jake's arm. "No, absolutely not. We're not going in there." Jake ignored her, stepping closer. "Whoever took my board might have been here. Or it's just an old creepy shack where no one's lived in decades," Sophie said, her voice shaking. "Jake, this is crazy." But Jake was already at the door. He pushed it open slowly, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was cold and stale, filled with the faint smell of damp wood. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in thick sheets from the ceiling. Jake stepped inside, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floorboards. Sophie lingered at the threshold, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. This place is so gross, she muttered. What are you even looking for? Anything, Jake replied, his eyes darting around the room. Something that explains why my board was out there. He moved to a small table near the window where a stack of old papers sat beneath a heavy layer of dust. Carefully, he brushed them off and picked one up. The paper was yellowed and brittle, covered in handwriting he didn't recognize. The words were written in a mix of English and another language he couldn't decipher. What's that? Sophie asked, finally stepping inside. Jake held up the paper. I don't know, it looks like notes or something. Sophie frowned, leaning closer. It's too faded to read. Can we go now? This place gives me the creeps. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but stopped abruptly. From somewhere deeper in the cabin came a faint sound, a creak like a footstep. Both siblings froze. Did you hear that? Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded slowly, his grip tightening on the paper. Someone's here. The escape. Jake and Sophie stood frozen, their breaths caught in their throats. The sound of the creak lingered in the air, the silence afterward almost deafening. Jake's eyes darted toward the hallway leading deeper into the cabin, his heart pounding. Let's get out of here, Sophie whispered, gripping his arm tightly. Jake nodded, his usual bravado completely gone. They moved cautiously toward the door, careful not to make a sound. Every step felt agonizingly loud against the creaky floorboards. Sophie's grip on Jake's arm tightened with each tiny noise that echoed in the empty cabin. They were almost at the door when another sound stopped them cold. The unmistakable thud of a door closing somewhere deeper in the cabin. Sophie's eyes widened. Panic etched across her face. Hurry, she hissed. Jake didn't need convincing. He shoved the cabin door open and they stumbled out into the cold, snowy clearing. The crisp mountain air hit them like a slap, but there was no time to relish the relief. They ran, their boots crunching loudly in the snow as they pushed through the woods, branches snapping against their jackets. Do you think someone saw us? Sophie gasped, her breath visible in the freezing air. Jake glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. The cabin was already out of sight, hidden behind the dense pines. I don't know, he panted, but we're not stopping. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the snow as the last light of day faded. The forest seemed to close in around them, every sound amplified. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and masking the sound of their hurried steps. Suddenly, Sophie grabbed Jake's arm, forcing him to stop. Wait, which way is the trail? Jake's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. He looked around, his heart sinking. The woods all looked the same, a maze of snow and trees. I thought I knew, he admitted, his voice shaking. You thought? Sophie snapped, panic rising in her voice. Are you serious, Jake? Keep your voice down, Jake whispered sharply. We can figure this out. The lodge isn't far. Sophie was about to retort when a new sound froze them both, the crunch of snow under deliberate, heavy footsteps. It wasn't theirs. It was coming from somewhere behind them. Sophie's eyes filled with terror. Jake, she whispered. Someone's following us. Jake didn't answer. He grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, his earlier confidence replaced by sheer determination to get out of the woods. They stumbled through the snow, their legs burning with effort. The footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, as if whoever or whatever was following wasn't bothered by the uneven terrain. There, Jake exclaimed, pointing ahead. Through the trees he saw the faint glow of a light. It wasn't the lodge, but it was something. A small lantern hanging near a trail marker. Sophie didn't hesitate. Let's go. They bolted toward the light, adrenaline overpowering their exhaustion. As they reached the trail marker, the footsteps behind them suddenly stopped. Jake turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the woods were empty, silent except for the wind. Where did they go? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head, his chest heaving. I don't know. Maybe we lost them. The light from the lantern illuminated a small path leading back toward the main trail. Jake gripped Sophie's arm. This way. We'll be back at the lodge in no time. They followed the path, their pace quick but cautious. The woods seemed less oppressive now, the faint light of the lantern guiding their way. As they neared the edge of the forest, the comforting sounds of the lodge came into earshot. Laughter, clinking glasses, and faint music. Relief washed over them as they stepped back onto the main trail, the lodge's warm lights shining in the distance. Sophie let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't believe we made it. Jake's hands trembled as he clutched his snowboard. What was that? Who was in the cabin? Sophie shook her head, her voice barely audible. I don't want to know. Back in the safety of their suite, Jake locked the balcony door and pulled the curtains tight. Sophie sat on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Emily and Mike hadn't noticed their absence long enough to ask questions, and neither sibling felt like explaining. As Jake inspected his snowboard, something caught his eye, a small carved symbol on the underside. It hadn't been there before. The design was intricate, almost ancient-looking, and it sent a chill down his spine. What is it? Sophie asked, noticing his expression. Jake hesitated, then showed her the board. This wasn't here before. Sophie stared at the symbol, her face pale. What does it mean? Jake didn't answer. Deep down, he had a feeling their nightmarish experience in the woods was far from over. The symbol's secret. The next morning, the Harris family sat in the lodge's cozy dining area, sunlight streaming through the large windows. The cheerful atmosphere seemed to mock the tension Jake and Sophie felt. Jake stared at his untouched plate of pancakes. The image of the carved symbol on his snowboard burned into his mind. Are you okay, Jake? Emily asked, noticing his distant expression. Yeah, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Just tired. Sophie shot him a sharp look but stayed silent, clearly unwilling to bring up the events of the previous night in front of their parents. Jake glanced at her and she gave a subtle shake of her head, warning him to stay quiet. Mike leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee. Well, after breakfast, let's hit the slopes again. Fresh snow overnight and the forecast says it's perfect conditions. Sure, Sophie said quickly, her voice higher than usual. Sounds great. Jake nodded reluctantly, though his mind was elsewhere. The symbol on his snowboard nagged at him like an unsolved riddle. He needed answers. As the family suited up for another day on the slopes, Jake slipped away under the pretense of grabbing a spare pair of gloves from the room. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the symbol on his board, then did a quick search online. Nothing. The symbol didn't match anything obvious. Frustrated, he tried a reverse image search, which yielded a single result, a blurry photo of the same symbol carved into a wooden beam. The accompanying text was sparse, but one line caught his eye. A marker tied to legends of the Canadian Rockies, thought to ward off spirits. Ward off spirits, Jake muttered, his pulse quickening. What are you doing? Sophie's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, her ski jacket half zipped. Looking this up, Jake admitted, showing her the picture and the search results. Sophie's eyes widened. What does that mean? Spirits? Jake shrugged, though the unease in his gut told him it wasn't something to dismiss lightly. I don't know, but it's weird, right? Why would someone carve this on my board? Maybe it was the person in the cabin, Sophie whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Do you think they're trying to warn us or scare us? Jake bit his lip. I don't know, but I want to find out. The day on the slopes felt surreal. Jake couldn't focus on his snowboarding, and Sophie seemed equally distracted. Every shadow in the woods felt like it was watching them, and every sound of cracking branches sent shivers down their spines. By late afternoon, Jake had made up his mind. We need to go back to the cabin, he told Sophie as they rode the ski lift together. She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Are you serious, after what happened last night? Jake nodded. If we don't, we'll keep wondering. We need to know what's going on. No, we don't, Sophie argued. We need to stay far away from that place. Then stay here, Jake said firmly. I'll go alone. Sophie groaned, throwing her hands up. You're impossible. You know that? Fine. But if we die out there, it's your fault. As dusk fell, the siblings made their way back toward the woods, this time with flashlights tucked into their jackets. The snow was deeper now, the path to the cabin more obscured. They walked in silence, the tension between them thick. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked even more foreboding than before. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Jake tightened his grip on his flashlight. "Let's make this quick," Sophie muttered, her breath visible in the cold air. Jake nodded, stepping inside. The interior looked the same, dusty, dimly lit, and eerily quiet. He moved to the table where he'd found the papers the night before, but they were gone. The surface was bare save for a single object, a small wooden box with the same symbol carved into its lid. Sophie gasped. "Was that here before?" "No," Jake said, his voice low. He hesitated, then reached for the box. It was surprisingly light. As he lifted the lid, a faint scent of pine and smoke wafted out. Inside was a folded piece of parchment and a small, circular stone. The stone was smooth and cold to the touch, etched with symbols that matched the one on his snowboard. "What is this?" Sophie whispered, leaning closer. Jake unfolded the parchment carefully. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as if written in haste. It was a mix of English and a language neither of them recognized. The English text read, "The marker protects. Do not remove it. Do not return." The word sent a chill down Jake's spine. He looked at Sophie, who was visibly pale. "Protects from what?" she asked, her voice trembling. A sudden noise from outside, louder and closer than anything they'd heard before, made them both jump. It was the sound of snow crunching under heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow. "They're here," Sophie whispered, grabbing Jake's arm. Jake stuffed the box and its contents into his jacket. "We need to go, now." They bolted out of the cabin, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran through the woods. The footsteps followed, faster now and accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing. Panic surged through them as the trees blurred together, the path back to the trail seeming farther and farther away. "There!" Sophie shouted, spotting the faint glow of the lodge's lights in the distance. They pushed themselves harder, their legs burning with effort. The footsteps were right behind them now, so close that Jake could almost feel the presence of whatever was chasing them. As they burst out of the woods and onto the main trail, the sound stopped. They turned, panting and wide-eyed, but the woods were still and empty, as if nothing had ever been there. Sophie collapsed onto her knees, her chest heaving. "What was that?" Jake didn't answer. He pulled the wooden box from his jacket and stared at it, his mind racing. Whatever they had stumbled into, it wasn't over, and he had a sinking feeling that it was just beginning. The Guardian's warning. The Harris siblings sat in the quiet of their suite, the wooden box resting on the coffee table between them. Sophie wrapped herself in a blanket, her gaze fixed on the box as if it might spring to life. Jake, seated across from her, stared at the stone and parchment, his mind racing. "We need to tell Mom and Dad," Sophie finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled with urgency. Jake shook his head. "And say what? That we found some creepy box in a cabin and got chased by something? They'd never believe us." Sophie glared at him. "Maybe they wouldn't, but we can't keep this to ourselves. What if it's dangerous?" Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustrated but unwilling to concede. "Look, we don't even know what's going on. We need to figure this out first." Sophie folded her arms tightly, her expression a mix of fear and frustration. "How are we supposed to figure anything out? We're just kids, Jake. This isn't some mystery movie." Jake glanced down at the parchment again, his eyes tracing the words. "The marker protects. Do not remove it. Do not return." "What if this marker is what's keeping us safe?" he said quietly. "Whoever left it on my snowboard, maybe they were trying to help." Sophie stared at him, her eyes widening. "Help us from what?" Before Jake could respond, a knock at the door startled them both. They exchanged a glance, their hearts racing. Sophie moved to the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. "It's the front desk guy," she whispered. Jake nodded, quickly stashing the box under the couch cushion. Sophie opened the door, revealing a man in a green lodge jacket with a friendly but tired smile. "Good evening," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I wanted to follow up about your snowboard. One of our staff mentioned they saw you with it earlier. I just wanted to confirm. Did you find it?" Jake hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I found it." The man's expression shifted subtly, his smile faltering for just a second. "That's good to hear. Where did you find it, if you don't mind me asking?" Jake and Sophie exchanged a nervous glance. Uh, just off the trail," Jake said, keeping his tone casual. "Near the woods." The man's face darkened, his friendly demeanor replaced by something far more serious. "The woods? Did you go into them?" Sophie tensed. "No," she lied quickly. "We stayed on the trail." The man studied them for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. The woods around here, they can be unpredictable. Best to stay clear of them." Jake felt his stomach churn. "Why? What's in the woods?" The man hesitated, his gaze flickering between them. "Just stories. Old legends from the area. Nothing you need to worry about. But please, for your safety, stay on the marked trails." With that, he gave a polite nod and left, leaving the siblings standing in stunned silence. After the man's departure, Sophie turned to Jake, her voice shaking. "He knows something. Did you see how weird he got when we mentioned the woods?" Jake nodded, his mind racing. "He said there are stories. What if the cabin's part of them?" Sophie groaned, dropping onto the couch. "I don't want to know what creepy stories this place has. I just want to survive the rest of this trip without getting chased by whatever that was." Jake paced the room, his thoughts tumbling over one another. "We need more information, something that explains this symbol, the box, the cabin. And how are we supposed to get that?" Sophie snapped. "Go back into the woods? No thanks." Jake stopped pacing, an idea forming in his mind. "No, not the woods. The library." Sophie blinked. "The library?" Jake nodded. "Every lodge has one, right? You said this place was full of history. Maybe there's something there about the legends he mentioned." Sophie groaned but didn't argue. "Fine, but if we find anything that says we're cursed, I'm leaving." The lodge's library was tucked away on the second floor, a cozy room lined with shelves of books and old photographs of the surrounding area. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the faint scent of leather and pine filled the air. Jake and Sophie slipped inside quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. They began scanning the shelves, looking for anything that might hold answers. "History of the Rockies," Jake murmured, pulling out a heavy book. He flipped through the pages quickly, his eyes skimming for anything familiar. Sophie, meanwhile, found a smaller book titled Legends of the Canadian Wilderness. She opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages. "Jake," she said after a few minutes, her voice low, "I think I found something." Jake hurried over, peering at the page she had stopped on. The heading read, "The Guardians of the Forest." Beneath it was a drawing of the symbol that matched the one on the snowboard and the box. Jake's heart raced as he read aloud. "The Guardians are said to be ancient spirits bound to the forests of the Rockies. According to legend, these spirits protect the land from intruders, but their protection comes at a cost. Those who disturb the balance of the forest risk awakening forces they cannot control." Sophie's face paled. "What does that mean? Are we intruders?" Jake shook his head, his eyes scanning the rest of the page. "It says the markers are warnings. They're supposed to keep the spirits at bay." Sophie pointed to the next paragraph. "What happens if you ignore the warnings?" Jake read the lines silently, his stomach sinking. "Those who ignore the markers or disturb the sacred grounds are said to face relentless pursuit by the Guardians until they restore what was taken or leave the land forever." Sophie's voice quivered. "Jake, we took the box." Jake closed the book slowly, his hands shaking. "And now they're coming for us." The Guardians awaken. The weight of the words in the book seemed to hang in the air, suffocating Jake and Sophie. The dim glow of the library's lamps cast eerie shadows across the room, and the crackling of the fire felt more like a warning than a comfort. "What do we do?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't just put the box back. What if they follow us again?" Jake's mind raced. The book said they want balance. Maybe we need to return the box and the marker. Sophie shook her head furiously. "You can't be serious. Going back to the cabin is how we got into this mess. What if we make it worse?" Jake exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. "And what if we don't? If we keep the box, they'll keep coming. We have to fix this." Sophie's lips tightened, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her resolve. After a long pause, she nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if we're doing this, we're going during the day. I'm not wandering into the woods at night again." Jake agreed. First thing in the morning. That night, sleep eluded them both. Every creak of the lodge felt like footsteps, every gust of wind like a whisper. Jake lay awake, the box resting on the nightstand beside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, even in the safety of their suite. At one point, he thought he heard soft footsteps outside their door, but when he checked, the hallway was empty. Morning came slowly, the sunlight creeping over the mountains as if reluctant to pierce the gloom. Jake and Sophie dressed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The box and its contents were tucked securely into Jake's backpack. As they made their way to the lodge's main entrance, Emily caught sight of them. "Where are you two off to so early?" Jake froze. Uh, just exploring some trails," he said, forcing a smile. "Figured we'd get out before the slopes get crowded." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Stay on the marked paths, okay? And don't go too far." "Got it," Jake said, ushering Sophie out before their mom could ask more questions. The siblings retraced their steps from the previous night, the fresh morning snow crunching under their boots. The woods felt different in the daylight, less menacing but no less unsettling. The air was still, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "This feels like a terrible idea," Sophie muttered as they approached the cabin. "What if they're already waiting for us?" Jake glanced over his shoulder. "Then we give them what they want and leave, quickly." The cabin came into view, its sagging roof weighed down by new snow. The door was closed now, as if whatever had pursued them the night before had sealed it. Jake's stomach churned, but he pushed forward. They stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards groaning under their weight. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, except for one chilling detail. The table in the center now bore another box identical to the one Jake carried. "What the?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where did that come from?" Jake set his backpack down, pulling out their box. "I don't know, but if they want it back, let's not waste time." He placed the box beside the other one on the table. As soon as he did, a faint hum filled the air. Sophie took a step back, her eyes wide. "What's happening?" The hum grew louder, resonating through the walls of the cabin. The dust on the floor seemed to lift slightly, swirling in the faint light. Jake stumbled back, his heart pounding. Suddenly, the symbols on both boxes began to glow, their intricate carvings illuminated by an otherworldly light. The glow spread, tracing lines across the floor and walls like veins of molten gold. Sophie grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to leave, now." Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the glowing symbols. "Wait, what about the marker?" He pulled the stone from his backpack, the carved symbol on its surface now shining brightly. The hum intensified as he placed it between the two boxes. The light pulsed once, then erupted outward in a blinding flash. Jake and Sophie shielded their eyes, their ears ringing from the sudden silence that followed. When they opened their eyes, the cabin looked different. The dust was gone, replaced by smooth, polished wood. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the glow had faded entirely. "Did we fix it?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. Before Jake could answer, a voice echoed softly through the cabin, deep and resonant. "The balance is restored. Leave this place." The siblings froze, their eyes darting around the room. There was no one there. Sophie grabbed Jake's arm. "We're leaving, now." They bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until they reached the main trail. As they emerged from the woods, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. The lodge came into view, its warm lights a welcome sight. Back in their suite, Jake and Sophie sat in stunned silence. The box, the marker, and the glowing symbols were gone as if they had never existed. "Do you think it's over?" Sophie asked quietly. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think we gave them what they wanted." Sophie exhaled shakily, leaning back against the couch. "Good, because I'm never going back in those woods again." Jake managed a weak smile. "Deal." But as they settled into the relative safety of the lodge, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching and that their story wasn't finished. The final warning: the Harris family spent the rest of the day trying to return to normalcy, though the events of the past few days lingered like an unspoken shadow. Jake and Sophie avoided mentioning the cabin or the mysterious happenings to their parents, choosing instead to stay close to the lodge. But even in the comfort of the warm fire and the laughter of other guests, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. That night, Jake found himself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His snowboard leaned against the wall, seemingly back to normal, but the memory of the glowing symbol haunted him. He turned over, hoping sleep would finally come, when a soft noise caught his attention. Tap, tap. Jake sat up, his heart racing. The sound came again, something tapping against the glass door leading to the balcony. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and reached for the flashlight he'd left on the nightstand. "Sophie," he whispered. But his sister didn't stir. Tap, tap. Jake's grip on the flashlight tightened as he swung his legs over the bed and stood. The lodge was quiet, the only sound his bare feet against the carpet. Slowly, he approached the balcony door, his pulse pounding in his ears. The curtains were drawn, blocking his view. Jake hesitated, every nerve screaming at him to wake someone, anyone. But something compelled him forward. With trembling hands, he pulled the curtains aside. There was nothing there, just the snowy mountains under the pale light of the moon. He let out a shaky breath, relief flooding him. But as he turned to walk away, he heard it again. Tap, tap. Jake whipped around, his eyes scanning the balcony. This time he saw it, a faint shape in the corner just out of reach of the light. His flashlight beam wavered as he stepped closer, illuminating the figure. It wasn't human. The creature was tall and thin, its skin pale and almost translucent. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its elongated fingers pressed lightly against the glass. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The creature tilted its head, its gaze piercing. When it spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, like the echo of wind through the forest. "You have returned what was taken," it said, "but the balance is fragile. Stay away from the woods." Jake nodded slowly, unable to speak. The creature's eyes seemed to bore into him, its presence both terrifying and strangely calm. "The forest remembers," it continued. "Do not disturb it again." And just like that, the creature stepped back into the shadows. Its form dissolved into the night, leaving nothing but the faint imprint of its presence on the snow. Jake stumbled back, his flashlight falling from his grasp. He collapsed onto the bed, his heart hammering in his chest. For what felt like hours, he stared at the ceiling, unable to process what he had just seen. The next morning, Sophie immediately noticed Jake's pale face and shaky demeanor. "What happened?" she asked, pulling him aside before breakfast. Jake hesitated, then told her everything: the tapping, the creature, its warning. Sophie's face grew paler with every word. "What does it mean, the forest remembers?" she whispered. Jake shrugged, his voice low. "I don't know, but I think we're lucky we got out when we did." Sophie nodded, her expression grim. "So, we're never going back, right?" "Right," Jake said firmly. "Never." The rest of the trip passed uneventfully, but neither Jake nor Sophie ventured near the woods again. They stayed on the marked trails, keeping to the safety of the slopes and the warmth of the lodge. Their parents noticed their newfound caution, but chalked it up to fatigue. On their final day at Snowy Peak Lodge, Jake and Sophie stood on the balcony, looking out at the forest one last time. The snow-covered trees swayed gently in the breeze, their beauty masking the secrets they held. "Do you think it's really over?" Sophie asked. Jake didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the edge of the forest, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. Finally, he shook his head. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm not sticking around to find out. Sophie nodded and the two of them turned back toward the suite, the door clicking shut behind them. As the Harris family packed up and drove away from the lodge, the mountains stood silent, their peaks piercing the sky. The forest watched them leave, its secrets intact. And though the Harris siblings promised never to return, a faint hum lingered in the air, an ancient reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. If you enjoyed this thrilling journey through the snowy peaks and mysterious forests, don't forget to like, subscribe on Enjoy English, and share this story with your friends. Join us for more captivating tales that not only entertain but help you master English with ease. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's continue exploring new adventures together.